Karen's trial was already a mess, but no one expected her to freak out like this. When she realized that the sentence wasn't going to go the way she wanted, Karen had a fit of rage, knocked over the court table and went after the judge like she was going to slap him. Security guards tried to hold her back, but she struggled, shouted that it was all a conspiracy, and even tried to throw a shoe at the prosecutor. And what's worse, she thought it would help her win the case. Do you want to know how this story ended? Then watch until the end, because you won't believe what this woman did. The courtroom was packed. It was the kind of trial that no one wanted to miss, not even those who were only there to pay a traffic ticket. There was something fascinating about seeing a person completely out of control finally being confronted by justice. And who better to provide this spectacle than that woman? The session had already started a few minutes ago, but the atmosphere was far from formal. The judge, a gray-haired man with the patience of a saint, was visibly tired of the whole thing. The prosecutor, a serious woman who clearly wanted to get the case over with, was barely concealing her boredom. The defense lawyer? He was probably praying for the ground to open up and swallow him, because, let's face it, there is no legal argument in the world that can defend the mess this woman was causing. Sitting at the defense table, with her arms crossed, and the expression of someone who still hadn't understood that she was the defendant in the case, she snorted at every word said against her. She rolled her eyes like an angry teenager, and, from time to time, let out a debauched laugh, as if it was all a big joke. But she was the joke. The accusations? Well, it was an impressive list. Assault, battery, trespassing, resisting arrest, and that was just the basics. If someone started adding up the police reports she collected, they could put together a book. And yet that woman was there, acting as if she was the wronged party, as if everyone was conspiring to destroy her impeccable life. The defendant has refused to cooperate since the moment she was arrested, said the prosecutor, leafing through the papers in front of her. In addition, she caused a ruckus at the police station, threatened the officers, and even tried to steal one of them's pen to sign a release form that she invented herself. The judge sighed, wiping his hands across his face as if he already knew that this was going to be difficult. "Madam, do you have anything to say for yourself?" The woman uncrossed her arms, leaned forward, and opened her mouth. For a brief second, there was a thread of hope in the courtroom that she would finally show a little repentance, that perhaps she would understand the gravity of the situation. But, of course, that hope died before it was even born. "This is all a joke," the shout echoed around the room. Some people in the audience laughed, others sighed, and the judge just closed his eyes, as if he was gathering the strength not to retire right then and there. "The jury is bought," she continued, pointing her finger at the jurors as if she were the leader of a coup d'etat. "This trial is a farce, a frame-up against me. I'm a good citizen. I know my rights." She said this as she stood there, handcuffed. The lawyer, who until then had been trying to maintain a shred of dignity in the case, lowered his head, probably wondering if there was still time to change professions. The prosecutor just raised an eyebrow, as if she had seen it before, and was no longer impressed. The judge, on the other hand, was running out of patience. "If you continue with this behavior, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the room," he warned, with a tone that was no longer asking, but warning of the inevitable. But she didn't listen. Or worse, she listened and ignored it, because nothing in the world was more important than her own voice. She stood up, her eyes blazing with anger, and began to bang her hands on the table. Tum, tum, tum. Each beat echoed in the courtroom like a war drum, an announcement that things were about to get worse. "I don't accept this farce. You're trying to shut me up." The judge looked at the security guards at the door, already anticipating what was about to happen. The crowd in the audience began to murmur. Some people grabbed their cell phones, ready to record the moment when everything would come crashing down. And then it happened. With a scream of fury, she grabbed the edge of the table with both hands and, with all the strength she could muster, pulled forward. The table, which had definitely not been made for this kind of violence, toppled over like a felled giant. Papers flew everywhere, pens bounced on the floor, and the glass of water that was there turned into an improvised missile, wetting half the jurors. For a second, there was absolute silence, and then chaos. The jurors stood up in terror. Her lawyer tried to hold his head as if he was about to faint, and the security guards ran towards the accused. But she wasn't satisfied. She wanted more. Her eyes met the judge's, and in her twisted mind, he was the ultimate enemy, the great villain of her story, the man who needed to be punished for his injustice. And then, with the fury of 1,000 storms, she advanced. The courtroom erupted in screams. The judge's eyes widened. The security guards increased their pace. And the woman? Well, she was just getting started. For a brief moment, it seemed as if time had frozen in the courtroom. The judge, who until then had maintained a posture of authority, now stood motionless, watching in disbelief at the absurd scene before him. The audience held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. And the woman? She was in full attack mode. After knocking over the court table, she launched herself towards the judge as if she was about to settle everything with her arm. Her expression was a mixture of rage and delirium, her eyes wide, as if she truly believed that the courtroom was a battlefield, and that she was the wronged heroine who had to defeat her supreme enemy. The problem? She was no athlete. The heels she was wearing did nothing to help her attempt at heroism. In the middle of her attack, her right foot slipped on one of the papers that flew up as the table toppled. The imbalance was instantaneous. One moment, she was running to attack the judge. The next, she was falling straight to the ground like a tree that had just been felled by a lumberjack. And a nasty fall it was. The audience, which was already about to scream in panic, became confused. A second of absolute silence overtook the courtroom before someone let out an involuntary laugh. And then it was as if the spell was broken. The people who had been holding their tension for minutes finally gave in, and a murmur of restrained laughter filled the room. It wasn't a cinematic fall, nothing worthy of an action movie. It was something much more ridiculous. A completely clumsy fall. Arms thrown forward trying to grasp at nothing. Knees hitting the floor before the rest of the body. A dry thud, a groan of pain, and an entire courtroom watching that humiliation live. The judge, who had been paralyzed at first, finally blinked a few times, processing the scene. The prosecutor covered her mouth with her hand, clearly trying to hide a smile. The defense lawyer simply bowed his head, defeated, as if he were regretting the life decisions that had led him to this moment. But the woman wasn't willing to give up. Even though she was lying on the ground, with her dignity crumbling with her, she still wouldn't accept losing. With the agility of a person driven purely by hatred and shame, she rose to her knees, grabbing the first object she saw in front of her. And what was it? Her own shoe. Yes, she ripped one of the heels off her foot, and, without a second thought, threw it in the judge's direction. It was a pathetic throw. The heel spun in the air a few times before falling to the ground, a meter away from the judge, without even getting close to the target. If her intention was to appear threatening, the effect was completely the opposite. If before people had been holding back their laughter, now no one was trying to hide it. The courtroom was breaking up into muffled laughter, shocked whispers, and exchanged glances between those present. A woman in the back let out an, "Oh my God," as she shook her face, trying to pull herself together. The security guards, who until then had been rushing to stop the attack, stopped for a second. It was as if they were processing the scene, trying to understand whether it had really happened or whether they were hallucinating. The judge, for his part, simply sighed. He didn't shout, he didn't squawk, he didn't make a big speech about respect and decorum. He just slowly rubbed his face, closing his eyes for a moment, as if he deeply regretted all the choices that had led him to be there, at that moment, having to deal with this. But the woman hadn't given up yet. She tried to stand up again, but the other shoe, which she still hadn't taken off, became an obstacle. As she tried to take a step, Her heel caught on the hem of her pants, and once again, there she was on the ground. This time, the security guards wasted no time. The two large, impassive-looking men moved in quickly, grabbed her by the arms and lifted her off the ground without the slightest effort. She struggled, of course. She tried to break free. She tried to kick. She tried to shout something about being a political prisoner or a victim of a corrupt system, but no one was taking it seriously. She didn't look like a wronged revolutionary. She looked like a spoiled child throwing a tantrum because someone didn't let her win at the game. The security guards held her firmly, immobilizing her arms to prevent further attempts at aggression. But she was still shouting, "This is a trap! I demand my right to speak. You can't do this to me." But they could, and they did. The judge, finally regaining his patience, looked at the security guards and made a simple gesture with his hand. The order was given. While the woman was still struggling, the two security guards began to drag her out of the courtroom. Her screams became louder, more desperate, as if she really believed that she still had a chance of turning things around. But it was too late. The door opened. The entire courtroom watched as she was carried out, wailing, screaming, cursing, and then the doors closed behind her. The silence that followed was almost deafening. The judge took a deep breath. He looked at the prosecutor. He looked at the defense lawyer, who looked exhausted. "I think that settles the question of sentencing." The courtroom was still vibrating with the chaotic energy that woman had left behind. The jurors exchanged confused glances, trying to understand whether it had really happened or whether it was part of a collective outburst. The prosecutor, despite maintaining her professional posture, was clearly holding back a smile. The defense lawyer, on the other hand, looked defeated, as if he knew that his career would never recover after that case. But no one there was more tired than the judge. After watching his own courtroom turn into a makeshift wrestling ring, he was visibly at the limit of his patience. His hands were intertwined on the table, his eyes fixed on the door through which the woman had been dragged out. For a moment it seemed that everything was finally going back to normal. But, of course, it wasn't that easy, because outside, in the corridors of the courthouse, the woman was still struggling to prove that she was the victim of the situation. She struggled in the arms of the security guards, kicking the air as if she still thought she could escape. One of the security guards, already used to dealing with problematic people, held both her arms as if he were dealing with a tantruming child. The other just walked alongside, ready to intervene if necessary. But Karen, or rather, that creature who refused to accept reality, wasn't ready to give up. "You can't treat me like this!" she screamed, trying to break free. "I know my rights. I demand to speak to the judge." No one answered. The security guards had a job to do, and arguing with her wasn't in their contract. As they continued to drag her down the corridor, other court employees peered through the ajar doors, curious to see what was going on. Some laughed quietly. Others just shook their heads in disbelief, because that's what happened when someone went beyond the limits of what was acceptable. And this woman? Well, she didn't just push the boundaries, she completely destroyed them, danced on the wreckage, and then tried to blame the system for her own idiocy. The security guards made their way to the back exit of the courthouse, where a police car was already waiting. The driver, a grim-faced veteran policeman, just raised an eyebrow when he saw the scene unfolding in front of him. "That one took some doing, huh?" he commented, opening the back door of the car. The security guard holding the woman just snorted. "You have no idea." Karen, realizing that she was about to be thrown into a police car, made one last desperate attempt. She threw her body backwards, stiffening her legs like a piece of wood, making the security guard's job more difficult. "No, I'm not going. This is a kidnapping." The security guards exchanged glances. One of them sighed deeply. The other rolled his eyes. "Ma'am," said the policeman, crossing his arms as he looked at her with an expression of pure impatience, "you are being taken to temporary detention. This is not a kidnapping. You have no evidence against me." The security guards gestured to the destroyed courthouse inside. "Oh, no," said the policeman, raising an eyebrow, "because, from what I've seen, the courthouse now looks more like a war zone." Karen opened her mouth to retort, but was speechless. For a brief moment, she stood there, breathing heavily, her eyes scanning the room, trying to find some way out of the situation. But there was no way out, and she knew it. So instead of continuing to fight, she did what anyone without a shred of dignity would do. She decided to collapse emotionally. Suddenly, her knees gave way, and she sank to the floor, letting out a dramatic sob that sounded rehearsed. I just wanted justice." No one there fell for it. The security guards didn't let her go. The policeman didn't show a shred of sympathy. She had played this game before. This time, no one was willing to play along. "Come on, ma'am," said the policeman, out of patience, and with one last push, they got her into the car and closed the door. Inside, alone in the back seat, she finally seemed to realize that she was no longer in control of the situation. Her chest was rising and falling rapidly, her makeup smeared, her hair messy. What had once been an arrogant, self-righteous woman now looked like someone who had been run over by her own stubbornness. The car pulled away, and the court breathed a sigh of relief. But the damage had already been done. The judge's desk was still overturned on the floor. Papers were scattered everywhere. Some chairs were overturned. It was as if a hurricane had blown through the place. Only in this case, the hurricane was soundtracked by high heels and cries of despair. The judge took a deep breath and massaged his temples. He had dealt with difficult cases before, but nothing compared to this. "Well," he finally said, looking at the prosecutor, "I don't think we need any more evidence to wrap this up, do we?" The prosecutor smiled sideways. "Definitely not, Your Honor." And so, without any further interruptions, the trial ended. Outside, while she was being taken to the police station, the woman continued to insist that she was the victim of a conspiracy, that it was all a scam against her. But inside the courtroom, everyone knew the truth. She wasn't a victim. She was the problem itself. And now, finally, she was reaping the consequences of her actions. If anyone thought that, after the courtroom scandal, that woman had finally learned her lesson, well, they'd clearly never heard of her before. Because even after being dragged out of court, thrown into a car, and escorted to the police station, she still refused to accept that the party was over. The police car had barely turned the corner when she started screaming again, punching the door of the back seat, as if she really thought she could get out of there by force of will. "I demand to be released immediately! This is absurd!" The policeman driving didn't bother to reply. He'd seen this guy before. People who think that the law simply doesn't apply to them. Who believe that a well-timed scandal can turn any situation around. But unfortunately for her, this wasn't a TV show. No one was going to appear out of nowhere to give her a happy ending. She was going to jail. And that was that. The car arrived at the police station and parked at the side entrance. The officer walked around the car, opened the door, and waited. She stood still for a second, huffing angrily. She looked at him as if hoping that, in a miraculous act, he would realize that he had made a mistake and let her go. He just crossed his arms. "Let's go." She didn't move. "I demand to speak to a lawyer." "And you will," replied the policeman, out of patience, "after you've been booked. Now, come on." She still tried to play hard to get, refusing to get out of the car like a child who doesn't want to get off the playground. But there was no more audience for her show. So, in the end, she had no choice. She got out of the car, slamming her feet down hard on the ground, as if she was punishing someone other than herself. The entrance to the police station was bustling. Officers came and went, too busy to pay attention to their new house guest. Some threw a quick glance in her direction, perhaps recognizing her from past incidents, perhaps just sensing the chaotic energy she carried with her. She was led to the counter, where a bespectacled policeman, clearly used to dealing with this kind of situation, was already holding a clipboard. Full name: She crossed her arms. "I won't answer anything without a lawyer." The policeman didn't blink. "All right, then. Then sit there and wait." She hadn't expected that. She expected him to insist, to make some kind of threat. But no, he just pointed to an uncomfortable metal bench in the corner of the room and went back to his papers, as if she were a problem that could be solved later. That hurt more than any punishment. Because, for someone like her, the worst thing in the world wasn't being arrested. It was being ignored. The woman snorted, looked around as if she were looking for some magical way out, and, with no alternative, walked over to the bench and sat down with an exaggerated thud. The minutes passed. After a while, an officer came to collect her belongings. Her cell phone was taken away, as was her handbag, which still had remnants of the court scandal, crumpled papers, a pen that probably wasn't hers, and, of course, the second shoe she hadn't yet thrown at anyone. She hadn't protested, yet, but her patience was hanging by a thread. And that's when the final blow came. When she was finally asked to give her fingerprints and have her registration photo taken, the officer in charge of the process asked her a simple question. "Do you want a bigger or smaller uniform?" It was a detail, a standard procedure. But for this woman, it was an unforgivable insult. "Uniform?" She stood up at once, her eyes blazing with indignation. "I'm not wearing that president's clothing." The officer didn't even blink. "Yes, you are." The dry reply made her blood boil. "I'm not a criminal." The officer sighed and looked at the policeman next to her. "The court says something else." That was enough to make her completely lose what was left of her composure. She started pacing back and forth, gesticulating, talking to herself, muttering about injustice, about how she had been betrayed, about how she was going to sue everyone involved. And then she had the worst possible idea. In a final act of desperation, she suddenly turned around and grabbed the officer's clipboard, as if it were some kind of symbol of power. "I demand to see my charges!" Before anyone could react, she started flipping through the papers, trying to find something that would prove that the whole thing was illegal. But, contrary to what her troubled mind imagined, she didn't find a loophole in the law. What she found was her own criminal record. And my God, it was quite a record. Her gaze ran down the list of charges: contempt, destruction of public property, resisting arrest, assault, disturbance of order. She kept turning the pages, looking at each incident recorded, each police report detailing her actions. Every mistake she had made was there, black and white. It was at that moment that something changed, because, for the first time, she seemed to hesitate. For a second, her eyes blinked too fast, her breathing faltered for an instant. It wasn't a great moment of enlightenment. It wasn't sincere regret, but it was a split second in which she realized that maybe, just maybe, she had crossed a line from which she could no longer return. But, as always, that split second didn't last long. She huffed, threw the clipboard back on the counter, and crossed her arms. "This is all a ridiculous exaggeration." The officer just took the clipboard back and calmly wrote something down before looking at it again. Large or small? And this time, with no other options, she remained silent. The woman had no choice. For the first time in her life, no one gave in to her stubbornness. No one begged for her approval. No one tried to convince her to accept the consequences of her actions. There were no fiery speeches or desperate lawyers trying to ease the situation. Just a cold, bored look from the policewoman waiting for the answer that deep down she knew would come. "Medium." That's what she whispered, her voice slurred and her eyes downcast, as if the word itself were a poison burning her throat. And so, without further ceremony, she was taken to a small room where she would have to change her good woman clothes for the uniform she despised so much. And that's when the next blow came to her already shattered dignity. Why dress herself? That would be easy. The problem was that she had to pass inspection. The prison officer, a middle-aged woman with the patience of a rock and the sympathy of an iron door, simply pointed to a small cubicle. "Raise your arms." The woman looked at her, outraged, as if hoping that simple indignation would change her mind. But the look she received in return was the same as a butcher would give to a piece of meat about to be cut. With no options, no control over the situation, and no more shouting to do, she obeyed. The process was humiliating. Each piece of clothing removed was another reminder that she wasn't special. She wasn't untouchable. She didn't own the world. She was just another prey. And that destroyed her inside. When she finally received her orange uniform, a simple, unglamorous piece of cloth, she held the fabric in her hands for a few seconds, as if she was still deciding whether to give in completely or make yet another scandal. But in the end, she put it on, and no one applauded. There were no protests or tears. There were no dramatic speeches about injustice. Just a woman sitting alone on an iron bench, looking at her hands, feeling the real weight of the consequences for the first time in her life. File ready. Take it to the block. And off she went. The cell was small and impersonal, painted a faded shade of gray that seemed to absorb any trace of cheerfulness from the surroundings. The bed was a piece of metal with a mattress too thin to be comfortable. There was a toilet in the corner, with no privacy at all, and that's where she was going to stay. The iron-barred door closed behind her with a dry, heavy clang, the sound of freedom being ripped away. The woman sat on the hard bed and stared at the wall. No one had come to see her. No important calls came to demand her release. No famous lawyer came up with a crazy plan to get her out. Because, after all, nobody cared. She wasn't a martyr. She wasn't a hero. She was just a joke. Outside the cell, the other inmates whispered among themselves, some exchanging amused glances. The arrival of a newcomer was always a source of curiosity, especially when that newcomer arrived shouting about her rights and demanding special treatment. But in there, rights weren't demanded. They were earned. And for the first time, the woman was in a place where her words meant nothing. She spent the rest of the day sitting in the same place, not talking to anyone, not fighting, not trying to prove anything to anyone. Her eyes were fixed on the floor. Maybe she was finally understanding. Maybe. Outside, the news of her arrest was already spreading. The video of the courtroom scandal had already been posted on social media, and the number of views was skyrocketing. Someone had put on a dramatic soundtrack, turned it into a meme, edited it with funny captions. The phrase, "I demand my rights," became a trend. Within days, it was viral on the internet, the new national joke. People watched and laughed. They commented on how unbelievable it was that someone could be so clueless. They made jokes about how she should win an Oscar for her performance. Some companies even started selling T-shirts with her picture on them and the ridiculous phrases she shouted in court. But none of that mattered to her, because, for the first time in her life, she wasn't the center of attention. She couldn't read the comments. She couldn't watch the videos. She couldn't say anything. All she could do was sit in that cold cell, listening to the noises around her, feeling the loneliness that comes when the world moves on and you're left behind. And so, the woman who always shouted louder than everyone else finally had to face the worst nightmare of her life. Regardless of the situation, has a Karen like this ever appeared in your life? Let us know in the comments and share your story with us. And if you liked this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like it. It really helps to bring you more absurd stories like this. Would you like to see more videos like this? Then click on card right now and don't waste any more time. See you in the next video.